It begins where most histories end, in a layer of dried mud. At the ancient tell of Shuruppak, in what is now southern Iraq, the wind moves dust across a landscape of low, eroded mounds. These are not hills. They are the compressed remains of a city, layer upon layer of human life packed beneath the earth. For decades, archaeologists have worked their way down through this archive of soil, reading the passage of dynasties in the shifting styles of pottery and the foundations of forgotten buildings. Near the strata dated to the dawn of the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE, they found what they were expecting: a thick, uniform deposit of sterile river silt, the unmistakable signature of a catastrophic flood that scoured the city from existence. This was it, the physical proof of the Great Flood, the one remembered in the epics. The work of an excavation is a slow conversation with time, measured in the careful scrape of a trowel and the patient whisk of a brush. Each layer downward is a step further into a silence that has held for millennia. The archaeologists who first worked this ground were methodical, documenting the remnants of life just below the flood deposit, the last traces of a world that was about to be washed away. They recorded the fire pits, the storage jars, the outlines of reed houses. They catalogued a civilization on the cusp of its own memorialized end, believing they had reached the bottom of that particular story. The ground, however, was not finished speaking. The descent continued, moving past the last signs of the pre-deluge city, into a stratum that should have represented a much older, more primitive occupation. Instead, they found something else. Below the layers of settlement that preceded the famous flood, there was another line in the earth. It was older, deeper, and geologically distinct, yet its composition was identical: a thick blanket of alluvial clay, deposited by a river that had violently broken its banks. This was not a localized event. It was a second ending, a separate and complete inundation that had also destroyed whatever city stood there in an even more distant past. The earth at Shuruppak held the memory of two apocalypses. One lived in legend and text. The other lived only in the silent testimony of a layer of hardened silt, an event for which no official record seemed to exist. The question, then, was not whether the flood happened, but which one. A silence settles over the excavation trench when a discovery like this is made. The wind seems to hold its breath. The physical evidence presents a fact without a narrative, a body without a name. This deeper layer of clay is a definitive statement, an artifact as conclusive as a king's seal, yet it points to a history that has been overwritten. It suggests that the great foundational cataclysm that Sumerian civilization built its later identity upon was not the first. It was merely the one they chose to remember. The presence of two flood deposits creates a problem that cannot be solved by digging further. It forces the investigation to move from the earth to the archives, to the clay tablets where history was first written down. The official story is, on its surface, unambiguous. The Great Sumerian King List, a document of immense political and religious importance, treats the flood as the central pivot of all existence. It is the wall that separates deep, almost mythical time from the political reality of the city-states. The formula is precise, administrative. Before the flood, a certain order of things existed. After the flood, a new order began. The event itself is mentioned with bureaucratic finality. Then the flood swept over. There is no poetry in the statement, no lament. It is recorded as a change in cosmic administration, a line drawn in the ledger of the world. All of history, as the scribes presented it, was cleaved into a before and an after, but the nature of that before is where the official record becomes strange. The King List does not begin with the creation of the world. It begins with the establishment of an institution. After the kingship descended from heaven, the text states, the kingship was in Eridu. It then proceeds to list 8 kings reigning in 5 different cities, a seamless succession of power that lasted for a total of 200 years. These are not described as gods or mythical spirits, but as kings, the first entry in a continuous line of rule. The scribe who compiled this list was not writing a poem. He was documenting a political lineage, treating a period of almost 250,000 years as a stable historical epoch with known rulers and established capitals. Here, the quiet contradiction begins to surface. The list meticulously records an impossibly ancient, yet orderly, civilization that existed before the flood. It presents a world that was not a chaotic primordial soup, but a functioning political system under a continuous institution of kingship. The flood, then, was not a battle against chaos to create order. It was an interruption of an order that was already in place. The text acknowledges this vast, stable world and then, in the very next line, announces its complete destruction. It offers no explanation for this paradox. It simply states the continuity of the old world and then the finality of its end, as if both were equally routine administrative facts. This creates a tension between the record and the event. If the pre-Diluvian world was so well documented, so administratively coherent, why is its end the only end that is remembered? Why does the memory of the Sumerian people, codified in their most important state documents, begin with the aftermath of a catastrophe that supposedly reset everything, while simultaneously preserving the records of what came before? The king list presents the flood as an absolute rupture, yet its own structure insists on continuity. It is a document that remembers what it claims was erased, a history that begins by acknowledging a far longer history that it has no intention of explaining. The silence returns, but it has changed. It is no longer just the silence of the deep earth at Shuruppak, but the silence within the text itself. It is the gap between the last pre-Diluvian king and the first post-Diluvian one. It is the administrative void left by an event that serves as both a historical marker and a convenient erasure. The invisible antagonist of this story is not a person or a deity, but this structural forgetting. The deeper flood layer suggests a physical event was erased from memory. The king list suggests a historical epoch was acknowledged and then sealed away. The two pieces of evidence, one from the ground and one from the clay tablet, point to the same unsettling possibility, that the official beginning of history was built upon the deliberate forgetting of an older one. Some questions are not meant to be answered, only to be held. They are like fragments from an excavation that do not fit into any known vessel, yet their weight in the hand is undeniable. To remain with such questions is to keep a different kind of vigil. It is a recognition that the quietest parts of the archive, the gaps between the records, hold a story of their own. For those who feel the pull of such absences, it is important to keep this space nearby. Some histories are only accessible in the long watch that follows the closing of the official ledger. The official record begins not with an act of creation, but with an act of administration. On a clay tablet catalogued as WB 444, a scribe, whose name is lost, dipped his stylus and made the first entry into a ledger of time itself. The line is precise, unambiguous, and unadorned by myth. It states, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." This is not the language of poetry. It is the language of a transfer of cosmic assets, the opening of a file. The institution of rule is established as a pre-existing concept, delivered to a specific location on Earth. The world does not begin. It is assigned its first manager. In Eridu, the ledger continues. The first king receives his entry. His name was Alulim. The scribe does not record his deeds, his character, or the nature of his court. He records only the single most important administrative detail, the duration of his tenure. Alulim, it is written, ruled for 800 years. The number is set down with the same dispassionate clarity as an inventory of grain sacks or a tally of livestock. It is a figure meant to be filed, not interpreted. It exists as a sterile fact, a unit of time so vast it resists human comprehension, yet it is presented as a simple historical datum, the first in a long and orderly sequence. The reign of Alulim concludes, and the next entry follows without pause or comment. The second king of Eridu is named Alalangar. Again, the scribe's focus is singular. The text records his reign as lasting for 36 Eluzaran years. The sequence is unbroken. The numbers are precise. The function of the document is clear: to establish an uninterrupted continuity of rule from the moment kingship first arrived. The combined tenure of these two rulers in a single city totals 800 years, an epoch of stability that the record treats as a routine opening chapter in its long account. There is no mention of how these reigns ended, only that they did, and the institution continued. Then comes the first administrative transfer. The scribe writes with the same detached finality. Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. The collapse of the world's first capital city is noted as a procedural event. There is no explanation of war, disaster, or decline. The city fell. The institution of kingship was not destroyed or interrupted. It was relocated. The language suggests a corporate headquarters moving to a new city after a local branch closure. The power itself, the abstract concept of kingship, is treated as a tangible object that can be packed up and moved, ensuring its own survival above all else. In its new location at Bad Tibira, the list resumes its methodical pace. 3 more names are entered into the record. The first is Enmenlu-Ana, whose reign is recorded as 200 years. He is followed by Enmengal-Ana, who ruled for 800 years, the same duration as the very first king, Alulim. The third and final king of this city is named Dumuzid, identified with a single descriptor, the shepherd. His reign is listed as 36 years, a direct echo of the second king, Alangar. The scribe is not just recording history, he is documenting a pattern, a deep numerical symmetry buried within the administrative flow of time. After the entry for Dumuzid, the scribe pauses his list of individual rulers to perform a calculation. He tallies the reigns in the second capital and adds a subtotal to the record, a standard accounting practice. The entry reads, 3 kings, they ruled for 108 Ziu-Auzaran years. This act of summarization reinforces the document's nature. It is an audit of deep time, a balance sheet of cosmic governance. The impossibly long lives and reigns are treated as assets to be counted and logged before the ledger can proceed to the next section. The humanity of these figures is absent. Only their function as holders of an office for a quantifiable period remains. The pattern of transfer repeats itself without variation. The record states, then Bad Tibira fell and the kingship was taken to Larak. Once again, a great city, the seat of power for over 100,000 years, ceases to be the capital. The event is given no more weight than the turning of a page. The institution of kingship proves itself to be more durable than the physical cities that house it. It moves on, leaving behind the silent ruins of another epoch, its continuity the only narrative thread that the scribe deems worthy of preservation. The process is relentless, mechanical, and utterly devoid of sentiment. In Larak, the list records only one ruler. His name is En-Sipad Zid-Ana. The duration of his reign is noted as 800 years. The number appears for the third time in the pre-Diluvian record. This repetition of specific enormous figures, 28, 800, 36, Ziwasaras, begins to feel less like arbitrary myth-making and more like a coded system, a technical language whose key has been lost. The scribe is not inventing numbers. He appears to be transcribing them from an older source, preserving their strange internal logic with absolute fidelity, even if their meaning is no longer transparent. He is a conduit for the data, not its author. The cycle continues. After 800 years, the single king of Larak's reign concludes, and the city's role as capital ends. The scribe makes the familiar entry. Then Larak fell, and the kingship was taken to Sipar. A fourth city enters the official history. The succession of capitals reads like a list of abandoned project sites. Each one served its function for a cosmically significant period and was then decommissioned. The stability is not in the place, but in the process. The world before the flood appears not as a paradise, but as a meticulously managed long-term operation, subject to periodic orderly relocations of its central command. At Sipar, another solitary king is recorded, Enmen-dur-Ana. His reign is listed as 21,000 years. This number breaks the recurring pattern of 28,836 Ziwa, introducing a new variable into the equation. It is a deviation, a slight irregularity in the otherwise symmetrical data set. For the scribe, this is simply another number to be recorded with precision. For the reader of the tablet, it is a small crack in the monolithic structure of the account, a detail that suggests the system being described was not perfectly uniform, that there were factors and measures at play which the simple list does not explain. The final transfer before the Great Rupture is then recorded. Then Sipar fell, and the kingship was taken to Shuruppak. This name hangs in the air, Shuruppak, the city of Ziusudra, the flood hero. The very place where the earth itself holds the physical memory of two distinct, world-ending floods in its layered soil. The administrative record, in its patient, linear progression, has led us directly back to the source of the physical anomaly. The text and the ground are beginning to converge on a single point in space, just before time is about to be broken. Perhaps this is a good moment to simply listen, to the silence of the room you are in, to register the time. The last entry in the pre-Diluvian ledger is made. In the city of Shuruppak, one king ruled. His name was Ubara-Tutu. His reign is recorded as 18,600 years, another unique duration, and significantly shorter than most of his predecessors. He is the final link in an unbroken chain of 8 rulers stretching back for nearly 250,000 years. His reign is the closing act of a world order that has known nothing but stability and continuity. The scribe records his tenure with the same steady hand as all the others, giving no indication that this entry marks the end of everything. With the reign of Ubara-Tutu concluded, the scribe performs his final calculation for this entire epoch. He summarizes the complete record of the world before the flood. The entry is a masterpiece of bureaucratic finality. Total, 8 kings. They ruled for 241,200 years, 5 cities. An entire age of the world, a span of time that dwarfs all of recorded human history, is condensed into a single, sterile line item. It is the final audit, the closing of the books on a completed cosmic project. The work is done, the data is logged, the period is closed. Immediately following this grand summary, without a single word of transition, lament, or explanation, the scribe writes the line that cleaves history in two. It is the most famous sentence in the entire document, made all the more powerful by its stark simplicity and its placement after such an immense weight of accumulated time. The text states, "Then the flood swept over." The event is not described. It is merely logged. It is an act of cosmic accounting, the final entry that balances the ledger of the old world and clears the slate for a new one. A different record, older and more fragmented, offers a glimpse behind this administrative finality. The tablet known as the Eridu Genesis describes the state of the world not in terms of kings, but in terms of function. It states that after the gods had formed the black-headed people, it was decided that their purpose was not worship or companionship. Humanity was created to perform a task. The text is explicit. They were made to bear the work of the gods, freeing the divine from labor. This is a charter of incorporation, not a creation myth. It establishes humanity as a workforce, a biological tool designed for a specific operational purpose. This same text records the decision to end the project. It was not a moment of divine rage or a punishment for human sin. It was a formal resolution, passed by a divine council. The text names the attendees, An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag. They gathered, and a vote was taken. The text states that they swore an oath to bring about the flood. The reason for this decision is not preserved in the surviving fragments. The record only notes that the termination of the human experiment was a deliberate, collective, and official act, sanctioned by the highest authorities. There was, however, a complication in the execution of this order. One member of the council, the god Enki, appears to have engineered a leak of classified information. The Eridu Genesis describes a strange, indirect method of communication. Bound by his oath not to speak directly to any human, Enki addresses the wall of a reed hut where a man named Ziusudra, the king of Shurupak, is sleeping. The god speaks to the inanimate object. "Wall, listen to me. Reed wall, pay attention to my words." It is a technical workaround, a way of obeying the letter of the law while violating its spirit, ensuring the information is passed on without breaking the oath. The information conveyed to the wall, and thus to Ziusudra, is a direct instruction. It is a contingency plan. The man is ordered to dismantle his house and build a boat of a specific design. The purpose is stated with administrative clarity: to preserve the seed of mankind. This is not an act of mercy born from affection. It is a pragmatic measure to ensure the continuity of a biological asset. Even the sole act of salvation is framed in the language of resource management, a final, cold calculation at the very end of the world, ensuring that when the floodwaters receded, the project could, if necessary, be restarted. The work no longer takes place in the trench, under an unforgiving sun. It has moved indoors, into the controlled silence of a conservation lab. Here, under the steady, low-angled light of a desk lamp, high-resolution photographs of the tablets are laid out side by side. The archaeologist's hands, gloved and steady, move a magnifying glass across the cuneiform impressions of WB444, the king list. Next to it, they place the fragmented lines of the Eridu Genesis. It is no longer about digging, but about seeing. The act of comparison begins, a quiet search for a resonance between two separate records, two distinct voices from the same extinguished world. The first pattern to emerge is not in the words, but in the numbers. The scribe of the king list records the pre-Diluvian rains with a strange and unwavering precision. 28, 800 years for Alulim, 36, Eozeran for Alalangar, 43, 200 for Enmenluana. These are not the vague, poetic numbers of myth. They are specific, discrete quantities, logged as if for an audit. When the rains are tallied for the city of Bad Tibira, the sum is a clean, round 108, Ciruadero. These figures are presented as raw data, a sequence of administrative facts stripped of any narrative context or explanation for their scale. A close examination of these numbers reveals they are not random. They are all multiples of a base unit known as a sar, a Sumerian measurement of 3,600. Alulim's reign of 28, 800 years is precisely 8 sars. Alangar's 36, Urdun years, is 10 sars. The subtotal for Bad Tibira, 108, Urdun years, is exactly 30 sars. The numbers are not expressing duration in a way we understand it. They are expressing values within a sophisticated mathematical or astronomical system. It is a schematic, a calculation disguised as a chronicle. This implies that the scribe was not a historian in our sense, but a technician. He was transcribing a pre-existing formula, a cosmological blueprint where the reigns of kings were not measured by lived experience, but by their assigned position within a grand, cyclical machine. The history of the world before the flood was, it seems, a pre-calculated event. The impossibly long lives were not meant to be believed as literal human lifespans, but understood as components in a system of cosmic timekeeping, their values set long before they were ever lived. A stillness settles in the room, the kind found only in archives late at night. The dust motes dancing in the lamplight seem to move in slow motion. The weight of this realization is immense. A history that is not a sequence of contingent events, but the execution of a mathematical formula. A world whose primary function was to fulfill a numerical destiny. Its beginning and end points plotted on a chart we can no longer read. The clay tablets on the table are no longer just records. They are the surviving printouts of an ancient program. The researcher shifts their attention from the numbers to the structure of the list itself, and a second pattern locks into place. It is a procedural repetition, a bureaucratic cycle that governs the entire pre-Diluvian epoch. The formula is invariant. A city is named, kings are listed, and then the entry appears. Then, the city fell, and the kingship was taken to Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. The sequence is as predictable and dispassionate as the changing of a guard. The institution persists, while its physical locations are treated as disposable. One observes the specific phrasing used by the scribe. The cities are never described as being conquered, destroyed by war, or abandoned due to famine. The text uses a passive, neutral verb, they fell. This is not the language of catastrophe, it is the language of decommissioning. The transfer of kingship is equally sterile. It is taken or moved, as if it were a physical standard or a seat of government being relocated according to a long-standing protocol. The process itself is the only stable element in this ancient world. The implication is that the pre-Diluvian civilization was not a collection of competing city-states, as we see in the later post-flood era. It appears to have been a single unified project, managed from a series of sequential command centers. Each city had a designated operational lifespan, a period for which it would serve as the capital, the physical housing for the abstract institution of kingship. Once its term was complete, it was retired, and the institution was transferred to the next designated site. The world was not evolving, it was being methodically managed. To continue this watch requires a certain patience, a willingness to remain where the record falls silent. Those who understand this will know to keep this archive close, to not lose the thread of this particular investigation. The researcher's gaze now moves to the fragmented text of the Eridu Genesis, placed alongside the king list. The focus shifts from the how of the pre-Diluvian world to the why. The Genesis offers a purpose, a foundational charter that precedes the establishment of the first king in Eridu. It describes a world where the gods performed all the labor and grew weary of it. A decision was made. A new entity would be created to solve this problem. The text is brutally clear on the function of this new creation. The black-headed people were not made for worship, nor for companionship. They were brought into existence for a single explicit purpose, to bear the work of the gods. This is not a covenant between a deity and its people. It is a statement of work, a contract defining the role of a labor force. Humanity was engineered as a biological solution to a logistical problem for the ruling class. This functional definition of humanity provides the missing context for the functional nature of the kingship. If the general population was the workforce, then the kings listed in the Great List were their overseers, the managers of the terrestrial project. Their impossibly long reigns represent the stability of this management structure, an unbroken chain of command from the project's inception. The king list is the personnel file of the project's senior leadership, documenting their tenures before the entire operation was shut down. A powerful resonance emerges between the two documents. The Eridu Genesis describes the high-level, executive decision to terminate the human project. The text speaks of a divine council, an oath sworn, a resolution passed to bring about the flood. The king list, in its turn, records the administrative consequence of that decision. After 200 years of operation, the logbook simply states, Then the flood swept over. One tablet is the minutes from the board meeting. The other is the final entry in the company ledger before closing the doors. The combined testimony of these texts paints a chilling picture. The Great Flood, the foundational myth of a new beginning for so many cultures, is reframed here as something far colder. It was not an act of chaotic nature, nor a passionate punishment for human sin. It was a planned demolition. It was the orderly, sanctioned and deliberate decommissioning of a worldwide enterprise that had run its course or had been deemed obsolete by its creators. One pauses to consider the scene described in the Genesis. The gods, An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag meeting to decide the fate of the world. There is no drama in the text, no thunderous debate. There is only a decision, followed by an oath to enforce it. The silence that must have followed that vote feels heavier than any storm. It is the silence of a purely administrative finality, the quiet authority of those who can sign an order that will erase a world. But it is here, at the moment of perfect textual symmetry, that the ground beneath Shurupak rebels. The archaeologist returns to the survey charts, the cross-section diagrams of the Tell's stratigraphy. The neat singular narrative of the tablets, a single project, a single termination, is directly contradicted by the physical evidence. The Earth holds the memory of two distinct, catastrophic floods, two complete erasures of the city that stood there. The pattern of the text is clean. The pattern in the soil is broken. The human researcher traces the lines on the diagram with a fingertip. The upper flood layer, dated to 2900 BCE, corresponds perfectly with the timing of the end of the early dynastic city, the one Ziusudra would have ruled. Below it, separated by the remains of an earlier settlement, is the other line, older, deeper, an ending for which there is no corresponding entry in the administrative ledger of the king list. The official record is singular. The physical record is plural. This contradiction opens a new and more difficult line of inquiry. The pattern of a meticulously managed world, so clear in the texts, is fractured by the untidy reality of the earth. If the pre-Diluvian system was so orderly, so perfectly documented by its scribes, what was the first flood? Was it a system failure the official report deliberately omitted? An earlier, unauthorized termination? Or was it something else entirely, an event so fundamentally different that it had to be written out of the program, its memory buried under a second, more convenient apocalypse? To understand the dissonance between the Earth's memory and the scribe's ledger, one must look past the kings and the cities to the entities that the records name as the system's architects. The tablets do not begin with humanity. They begin with a governance structure already in place, a hierarchy whose members are named but never described. They are not characters in a story. They are entries in an organizational chart, the silent, unseen authority that precedes the first king, the first city, and the first act of recorded time. Their presence is a structural fact of the world they designed, as cold and impersonal as the bedrock beneath the foundations of Eridu. The texts refer to them by a collective designation, the Anunnaki. In the earliest administrative and legal documents, this is not a name for a pantheon of individual gods, but a term for a specific class of being, a defined group with a formal status. They are often described as those who from heaven to earth came. This is not presented as a poetic metaphor, but as a statement of origin and operational theater. Their primary function, as recorded in the fragments, is to assemble. They form a council, a deliberative body whose decisions have the force of cosmic law. They are a legislature, and the fate of the world is an item on their agenda. The structure of this assembly is hierarchical and clear. The records consistently place a figure named An at the apex. His name is the cuneiform sign for heaven or sky. But his function is not that of a passive sky father. He is the source of authority. It is from An that the institution of kingship descended. He is the remote chairman of the board, the ultimate holder of the franchise, but his direct actions are seldom recorded. He presides, he legitimizes, but he does not intervene in day-to-day operations. His power is foundational, a silent premise upon which the entire system rests. Below An, the operational authority is vested in Enlil. His name is translated as Lord of the Command or Lord of the Wind, but his role in the texts is that of the chief executive. It is Enlil who executes the decrees of the divine assembly. When a decision is made, it is his word that carries it into effect. The texts portray him as the enforcer of the cosmic order, the one who ensures the system functions according to the Council's resolutions. He is not a god of chaotic storms, but the administrator of a controlled and unyielding power, the voice that speaks the final verdict into being. The third member of this primary triad is Enki. His domain is the Abzu, the deep waters, but his function is that of a chief engineer or a master of sciences. He is the one who understands the blueprint of creation, the technical specifications of the world and its inhabitants. In the administrative narratives, Enki is the problem solver, the one who devises the mechanisms and technologies required for the project of civilization. His wisdom is not philosophical, it is applied knowledge, the operational intelligence that makes the system work. He is the head of research and development, holding the patents on the world's design. This division of labor is not mythic, it is corporate. An is the seat of authority, the legitimizing principle. Enlil is the executive arm, implementing policy. Enki is the technical director, managing the physical and biological assets. They are not family members squabbling over provinces of nature. They are the directors of a vast enterprise, each with a defined portfolio of responsibilities. Their interactions, as recorded, are not driven by passion or jealousy, but by procedural debates concerning the management of their terrestrial project. The world is not their kingdom, it is their worksite. The texts reveal another layer to this structure, a subordinate class of entities called the Igigi. Their role is explicitly defined by their function. They were the original labor force. The Atrahasis epic, a record that reads more like a series of internal memos than a poem, states that for thousands of years, the Igigi were tasked with the heavy physical labor of maintaining the world. They were the ones who dug out the canals and piled up the mountains. Their existence was one of toil, a long sentence of hard labor in service to the Anunnaki Directorate. This arrangement eventually failed. The records describe a moment of crisis, not as a war in heaven, but as an industrial dispute. After 40 Izars, 144,000 years of continuous labor, the Igigi rebelled. The text is specific. They were complaining, backbiting, they grumbled in the excavations. They refused to continue their work, setting fire to their tools and surrounding Enlil's chief residence. This was not a battle for cosmic supremacy. It was a strike, a coordinated work stoppage that brought the entire operation to a halt and created a logistical crisis for the administration. Faced with this labor insurrection, the Anunnaki Council convened an emergency meeting. The problem was clear. The project could not continue without a workforce. The solution, proposed by the chief engineer Enki, was radical. A new substitute being would be created, specifically designed for the task. This new entity would be engineered to be capable of bearing the physical burden that the Igigi had rejected. The decision was not about creating life for its own sake. It was about manufacturing a replacement for a non-compliant class of workers. This provides the cold, administrative context for the creation of humanity. The Eridu Genesis states that the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, was fashioned to bear the yoke of the gods. This was our species' founding charter, our statement of purpose. We were not created in a divine image out of love, but designed to a specification to solve a labor problem. Our existence was a line item in a revised project budget, a biological asset acquired to ensure the continuity of the terrestrial operation after the failure of the previous workforce. This functional origin of humanity clarifies the role of the pre-Diluvian kings listed on the tablet WB444. If the Anunnaki were the remote board of directors and humanity was the new labor force, the kings were the appointed overseers. They were the site managers, the intermediaries installed to manage the project on the ground. Their impossibly long reigns were not measures of human lifespan, but indicators of the immense stability of this management structure, an unbroken chain of command stretching across millennia, ensuring the work continued as planned. The king was a conduit, not a sovereign. His authority was not his own. It was delegated from the true owners of the project. He was the shepherd of the black-headed people, tasked with managing the human flock to maximize its productivity. His duty was not to his people, but to the system he served. The king list, in this light, is not a chronicle of dynasties. It is a succession plan, a personnel file for the senior management of a vast, planetary-scale enterprise, meticulously kept by a scribal bureaucracy. The world before the flood, then, was not a mythological landscape. It was a project, an organized, hierarchical, and functional operation with a defined purpose. The cities were not organic settlements but designated operational centers. The kings were not rulers, but administrators, and the gods were not deities to be worshipped, but the silent, unseen executives in charge of the entire venture. Their authority was absolute, their methods were bureaucratic, and their motives were entirely opaque, recorded only in the sterile language of decrees and resolutions. A deep silence emanates from this model of the world. It is the silence of a boardroom after a momentous decision has been made. The figures of An, Enlil, and Enki retreat from view, leaving only their recorded functions behind. They are faceless, without personality or passion, existing only as titles on a cosmic letterhead. They are the others, the true authors of the system, and their nature remains a perfect and unnerving void in the heart of the record. They are a cause without a character, a power without a face. And if this rational, almost industrial structure was the true nature of the pre-Diluvian world, then the flood takes on an even more chilling aspect. It ceases to be a myth or a divine punishment for sin. It becomes a calculated, administrative act. It was the termination of the project, and the physical evidence of a second, unrecorded flood at Shurupak points to an unsettling possibility, that the project was terminated more than once. The question is no longer about the mechanics of the flood, but about the criteria for the project's success or failure. What, then, was the ultimate purpose of this vast, 241-200-year operation? The texts state that humanity was created to perform work, but they never specify the nature of that work. The product of this global enterprise is never named. The entire pre-Diluvian civilization, with its long-lived overseers and its engineered workforce, was a means to an end that is never stated. We are left with the organizational chart of a company whose business we cannot comprehend, and the record of its final, deliberate liquidation. The investigation now descends into a different kind of trench. It is not a channel cut into the earth, but a space carved out by time itself. We return to the stratigraphy of Shurupak, to the thin layer of human occupation sandwiched between the two flood deposits. The trowel scrapes against the evidence of a world that tried to begin again. Here, there are the faint traces of reed huts, the scattered shards of utilitarian pottery, the ash of hearths that were not lit for long. This is the material record of a recovery, a brief and fragile attempt to rebuild on the silt of a forgotten apocalypse, a world that existed only in the interval between two endings. This layer of intermediary settlement is unnervingly thin. It lacks the depth and complexity of the civilizations above and below it. There are no monumental structures, no evidence of a centralized bureaucracy, no accumulation of wealth or power. It speaks not of a thriving city, but of a survivor's camp, a temporary foothold in a world that had been wiped clean. The people who lived here existed in the shadow of a catastrophe we cannot name, and on the eve of a second one that would be immortalized. Their entire history is contained in a few inches of compressed earth, a fleeting presence that barely registered before it was erased again. The silence of this specific layer is profound. It is a documentary void. No king list mentions the rulers of this short-lived city. No economic tablets record its trade. No myths or legends recall its heroes or its gods. This civilization lived and died entirely outside the official record. It is a ghost in the strata, its existence confirmed only by the mute testimony of its own remains, a community whose complete life cycle passed without a single scribe ever recording its name. Its erasure was so total that even the meticulous record keepers who documented 250,000 years of history before it had no entry for it. We move from the silence of the earth to the silence of the text. On the tablet WB 444, the transition from the pre-Diluvian world to the post-Diluvian one is not a chapter break, but a single, impenetrable line. After the final summary, total 8 kings. They ruled for 200 years. There is no account of the final days, no lament for the cities about to be lost, no description of the cataclysm. There is only the stark, administrative statement. Then the flood swept over. How? This is not a narrative transition. It is a wall, a deliberate and absolute closure of one ledger before another is opened. The function of this sentence is not to explain, but to seal. It is a boundary line drawn across time, separating a vast, orderly, and now inaccessible past from the new reality that followed. The scribe does not look back. The narrative does not pause to mourn. The weight of 200 years of continuous civilization is dismissed with the same dispassionate finality as the closing of a file. The silence that follows this line is the sound of a door being locked, a deliberate act of structural forgetting that is built into the very architecture of the official history. Consider for a moment the weight of what is not said in that space. The final moments of the last pre-Diluvian king, Ubaratutu. The fate of the city of Shurupak, the final capital. The experience of the population as the waters rose. All of this is absent. The human cost, the geological terror, the cultural trauma, all of it is subsumed into a single, sterile, procedural note. This is erasure by administrative summary, a form of forgetting so profound that it does not even acknowledge that something has been left out. The record is not incomplete. It presents itself as perfectly and terrifyingly whole. Now, place the fragmented tablet of the Eridu Genesis beside the king list. Here the silence is made physical. The tablet is broken. Its surface is scarred by cracks and gaps where the cuneiform signs have flaked away. The most critical part of the narrative, the precise reason why the divine council decided to terminate the human project, is located in one of these lacunae. The text preserves the record of the vote, but the justification for that vote is lost in a physical void, a piece of earth broken from the whole. The silence here is not editorial. It is accidental, and in some ways, even more absolute. The hands of the researcher, gloved and careful, trace the edges of the missing fragment. The story breaks off at the most crucial moment. We are told who made the decision, and we are told what the decision was. But the why is a blank space on a piece of fired clay. This material silence is a constant reminder of the fragility of memory. The most important secret of the old world, the ultimate reason for its destruction, was entrusted to a medium that could shatter, and it did. We are left to stare into the gap, a void that holds the motive for a world's end. This absence of a stated motive in the Genesis resonates with the administrative silence of the king list. One record is missing its core justification due to physical damage. The other omits it by deliberate editorial choice. Both paths lead to the same destination, a world erased for reasons that are not recorded. The combination of these two silences creates an unsettling harmony. It suggests that the reasons for the flood were, perhaps, never meant to be preserved for those who came after. The termination was a high-level executive action, and its internal justifications were not part of the public record. This is a point where the investigation must pause. We are confronted by an absence that is both physical and structural. It is in the ground at Shurupak, in the grammar of the king list, and in the broken body of the Genesis tablet. Before proceeding, it is worth taking a moment to register this, to feel the presence of what is not there. This is the true antagonist of the story, the silence that guards the door to the earliest version of the world. It is an active, persistent force. What if this silence is not a void, but an artifact in itself? What if the act of not recording was as deliberate and meaningful as the act of inscribing the clay? The scribal culture of Mesopotamia was obsessive in its documentation of contracts, inventories, and omens. Their world was built on the principle that what was recorded was real. The decision to leave a space blank, or to summarize a cataclysm in a single line, was not an oversight. It was a choice. A choice to build the new world on the foundation of a perfectly curated silence. This curated silence extends beyond the flood itself. After the line, "the flood swept over," the king list pauses. There is a physical space left on the tablet before the record of post-diluvian kingship begins. It is an interval of unknown duration, a period when the earth was presumably empty, when the institution of kingship had no city to inhabit. This chronological gap is never quantified. It is a caesura in time, a moment of global suspension between two distinct operational phases of the world. History holds its breath in this empty space. When the record resumes, it does so with the same administrative calm as before. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The formula is almost identical to the one that began the pre-diluvian world, but with one crucial addition: the flood is now the new point of origin. It is the event that resets the clock, the new "in the beginning," from which all legitimate rule now flows. The silence between the two eras has served its purpose. It has laundered time, allowing the institution to re-emerge, cleansed of its past. But the memory of the older world was not entirely erased. It was encapsulated. The king list preserves the names and reigns of the pre-diluvian kings as a kind of sealed archive, a history that is acknowledged but made inaccessible. By placing it before the impenetrable wall of the flood, the scribes converted history into myth. It became a story of a lost, impossibly ancient time that had no direct bearing on the political realities of the new world. It was a past that could be remembered precisely because it was no longer relevant. This act of remembering as forgetting is perhaps the most sophisticated form of erasure. The pre-diluvian world was not denied. It was grandfathered in. It was given a place of honor at the very beginning of the record, a gesture that simultaneously legitimized the antiquity of the institution of kingship while sealing that ancient world away from the present. The 200 years of history became a preface, not a prequel, its continuity acknowledged and then immediately severed by the administrative blade of the flood. The two flood layers at Shurupak now appear in a new light. The deeper, unrecorded flood was a raw event, an ending without a narrative. The second official flood was a narrative without an event. Or rather, it was an event that was carefully selected and edited to serve a new purpose. It became the foundational story, the official rupture that allowed history to be rewritten. The true, older apocalypse was buried twice, first by a layer of river silt, and then again by a more permanent layer of official memory. We are left in a quiet room, surrounded by fragments. The evidence does not point to a single hidden truth, but to a process of deliberate information management on a cosmic scale. The world before the flood was not forgotten. It was archived. Its end was not a mystery. It was a classified decision. And the silence that surrounds it is not the gentle fading of memory over time, but the sharp, clean edge of a redacted document. The final silence is our own. It is the recognition that we are reading a history from which we have been deliberately excluded. The records were not written for us. They are the internal documents of a closed system, and we are looking at them thousands of years after the company has been dissolved. The story is not in the words on the tablets, but in the vast, silent spaces between them, spaces that were designed to be unbreachable. The quiet work of reconciliation is over. In the low light of the archive, the evidence laid out on the long dark table refuses to form a single, coherent narrative of a human past. The stratigraphy chart from Shurupak, with its two distinct lines of cataclysm. The clay tablet of the king list, with its impossibly precise and orderly chronicle of a world before that ending. The shattered fragments of the Eridu Genesis, which speak not of natural disaster, but of a formal divine resolution. To force these pieces together is to break them further. They do not tell one story. They point to a fundamental misinterpretation of the very nature of the record itself, a misreading of the language in which deep time was written. The problem may not be in the gaps between the records, but in the nature of the data they contain. The numbers themselves, 28, 800, 36, Iwurero, 241, 200, are not the rounded mythic figures of folklore. They possess a strange, technical precision. They behave less like the memories of a culture recalling its deep past, and more like the output of a system logging its own operational history. The reigns are not lives, they are logged periods of uptime. The succession of cities is not a political evolution. It is a documented change in server location. The entire king list reads not as a chronicle, but as an immense, cold, and perfectly preserved server log from a machine that was decommissioned long ago. From this perspective, the function of the others shifts entirely. An, Enlil, and Enki cease to be gods in any religious sense. They become the system administrators, the high-level operators with root access to the world's core functions. Their actions, as recorded, are not driven by mythic passions, but by a cold, operational logic. The creation of humanity to solve the Igigi labor strike was not an act of love, but a hardware upgrade, a patch to fix a critical vulnerability in the workforce. The decision in the Divine Council to bring about the flood was not a judgment, but a command line instruction to terminate a running process. The world was their project, and they managed it with a terrifying bureaucratic detachment. This redefines the entire institution of kingship that supposedly descended from heaven. It was not a divine right to rule over people. It was an operating system, an administrative interface installed to manage the primary terrestrial asset, the human workforce. The pre-Diluvian kings from Alulim to Ubaratutu were not sovereigns. They were the local managers of a planetary-scale enterprise, the designated overseers for a remote, and perhaps off-world, board of directors. Their authority was delegated, their function was procedural, and their long history was simply a record of the system's stability before its first great scheduled maintenance. A different kind of stillness now fills the air, a silence that is not empty but charged with a low, residual hum. It is the feeling of standing inside a vast, silent factory after the power has been cut. The dust motes that drift through the lamplight seem less like particles of time and more like the settled residue of a finished industrial process. The tablets on the table are no longer just the memory of a civilization. They are its final schematics, the abandoned blueprints for a machine whose purpose was never disclosed to the components that made it run. The silence is not of the past, but of a profound and permanent obsolescence. The double flood layer at Shurupak can now be seen in this new, colder light. If the official recorded flood was a planned shutdown, a deliberate and documented system wipe, then the first, deeper, and unrecorded flood was something else. It was an event outside the official log files. It was an unscheduled termination, a catastrophic system crash, a failure so profound that it was not recorded in the operational history because it was never supposed to happen. It was the blue screen of death for an entire iteration of the world, an error that the official record would later be written to conceal. The existence of that thin layer of settlement between the two floods now becomes the most critical detail in the entire investigation. The people who lived there were not simply survivors rebuilding their lives. They were an anomaly that should not have existed. They were a world attempting to reboot itself from the wreckage of the first crash, without authorization from the system's administrators. They were a rogue process, a fleeting and undocumented instance of life that emerged in the interval between a catastrophic failure and the arrival of the technicians sent to perform a full, restorative wipe. The second flood, the one the King list memorializes, was therefore not simply a repetition of the first. It was a response. It was a deliberate corrective action on a planetary scale. It was the complete reformatting of the drive, a controlled demolition designed not only to end the unauthorized world that had emerged from the ruins, but to ensure that the fundamental error that caused the first crash could not be repeated. It was an act of cosmic IT, a final and absolute solution to a persistent and dangerous bug in the system. In this context, the Sumerian King list is not a historical document. It is the release notes for the new version of the world. It carefully documents the history of the previous, now deprecated version, the pre-Diluvian kings, to establish the long pedigree of the operating system. But it seals that history behind the impenetrable firewall of the flood. The line, "Then the flood swept over," is the legal disclaimer at the end of the old user agreement. The past is acknowledged, but it is no longer supported. The new world, starting in Kish, is version 2.0, built on the clean slate of the second, official apocalypse. The unsettling implication is that Sumerian civilization, the very bedrock of our own recorded history, was itself a managed environment, a new installation running on a freshly wiped server. Its foundational myths, its laws, its concept of divine order, all of it may have been part of the new software package, designed to create a more stable and predictable world than the one that had crashed before. Our history did not rise from the mud of a natural disaster, but was installed in the wake of a technical correction, its narrative carefully curated to obscure the memory of the system's prior, catastrophic failure. A question then emerges that extends far beyond the dust of southern Iraq. If the foundational story of this one civilization can be reread as the managed record of a much older technological system, it suggests this might not be an isolated incident. The archives of the ancient world may be littered with such ghosts in the machine, other stories of endings and beginnings that conceal a history of system versions, reboots, and restorations. To follow this thread is to begin listening for the hum of the machine beneath all recorded myth. Humanity's role in this vast, operational timeline becomes almost an afterthought, a detail in a much larger schematic. Our species was engineered as a biological tool to solve a labor crisis among a higher order of beings. Our civilizations were the controlled environments in which that tool was put to work. And our most profound, world-shaping memory, the Great Flood, was little more than a footnote in a cosmic service ticket, an entry detailing the decommissioning of one project phase before the next was initiated. We are not the authors of this story. We are, at best, a single line of code in it. The persistent silence of the others is no longer a mystery. It is a feature of the hierarchy. System administrators do not explain the complexities of the architecture to the applications running on it. Their origins, their ultimate objectives, the very reasons for running the Earth project in the first place, would be functionally irrelevant to the human workforce designed to carry out its tasks. Their silence is not an oversight. It is the clean, cold expression of an unbridgeable distance in function and purpose. They do not speak to us through the records because the records were never for us. And yet, the ground at Shurupak remains. It holds the one truth that cannot be redacted by any scribe. The two layers of hardened silt are the physical, forensic evidence of two separate events. They are the ghost images on the hard drive, the remnants of a previous installation that was imperfectly wiped. The Earth itself has preserved the proof of the system's instability, a geological memory of the crash that preceded the controlled restart. The dirt beneath our feet is a more honest archivist than the men who first wrote history down on clay. We are left with a problem of scale that is almost too vast to hold. The history we have studied, the entire epic of human civilization, may be nothing more than a thin, recent layer of software running on ancient, unexamined hardware. The true story is not about the struggles of kings in Mesopotamia. It may be about the maintenance schedule for a machine we inhabit but cannot perceive, a machine whose purpose is unknown, and whose operators have already demonstrated their willingness to shut it down and begin again when it fails to meet their specifications. The final implication is not a statement, but a presence that hangs in the quiet air of the room. It is a question that destabilizes the very foundation upon which our sense of a human past is built. If our world is a project, and the official flood was merely its second beginning, then what was the objective of the first, failed iteration? And what in the design of this current version provides any guarantee that it is not, itself, approaching the end of its own designated operational cycle, its own final, scheduled obsolescence? The sun is low over the plains of Iraq, its light the color of old parchment. It catches the high points of the Tell at Shurupak, casting long, dark shadows into the depressions that were once streets and courtyards. The wind moves without sound across the eroded mounds, a steady and patient presence that has been here longer than any city, any king, any god. It is the only thing that still touches every layer of this place at once, from the sun-baked surface to the deep, damp clay of the first ending. Here, at the close of the day, the silence is not an absence of noise. It is the accumulated weight of everything that is no longer speaking, a presence so dense it feels like a physical pressure against the skin. In this raking light, the landscape reveals its true nature. It is not a place of hills, but a place of collapses. Every contour is the ghost of a fallen wall, every depression a room filled with the dust of its own ceiling. The light does not illuminate. It defines by shadow, carving out the negative spaces where life once was. This is a place best read in the diminishing light, when the hard facts of archaeology give way to the deeper truths of form and absence. One can almost feel the immense, slow gravity of time, the force that pulled these cities down into the earth, layer by layer, compressing millennia of human effort into a few meters of stratified dust and memory. A single weathered shard of pottery lies half buried in the loose soil on the slope. It is coarse, undecorated, the curve of its rim worn smooth by use and by the endless passage of the wind. It bears no inscription, no king's seal, no administrative record. It is a fragment of a common vessel, made to hold water or grain, used by a hand that has no name, in a life that left no other trace. This small piece of fired clay is a silent counter-argument to the grand narratives of the king list. It speaks for the unrecorded history, the countless lives that were the substance of the world, not its administration. It is a reminder that the past is not a list of rulers, but a vast, anonymous sea of which we have only recovered a few named drops. This object connects not to a text, but to a different kind of silence, the silence of the workforce. The men and women who were, according to the Genesis text, brought into being to bear the work of the gods. Their history is not written in cuneiform, but in the wear patterns on tools, in the foundations of buildings they erected, in the sheer mass of the city mounds themselves. The king list records the tenure of the overseers. The earth itself holds the anonymous record of the labor. To hold this sherd is to feel the immense, unwritten weight of that collective effort. the millions of lives that powered the machine before the machine was turned off. Not once, but twice. We are left here, between the clean, administrative logic of the clay tablet and the messy, layered trauma of the earth. One is a history of managed time, of orderly transfers of power and calculated cycles. The other is a history of rupture, of abrupt endings and unauthorized beginnings. They do not tell the same story, because they do not remember with the same purpose. The scribe remembered what was useful for the new world order. The earth remembers everything. It holds the memory of the system crash with the same dispassionate integrity as it holds the memory of the planned shutdown. It does not edit. It simply accumulates. One can almost see the scribe, his face lit by an oil lamp, his stylus poised over a tablet of wet clay. A man at the end of a long chain of transmission, tasked with compiling the definitive history. Did he understand the full import of the data he was transcribing? Did he feel the immense weight of the 200 years he was summarizing into a single line? Or was he simply a functionary, a component in a new system of information management, his role not to interpret the past, but to codify its official, sanctioned version? His name is gone. Only his work remains, a perfect and impenetrable piece of administrative architecture. A brief stillness settles as the last of the sun's light recedes below the horizon. The wind pauses. In this moment, the air itself feels ancient, filled with the fine, suspended dust of everything that has been. This dust is not an inert substance. It is the final, commingled form of everything that once stood here. It is the brick of the temple, the clay of the tablet, the bone of the worker, the gold of the king. The past has not vanished. It has simply undergone a change of state, becoming a permanent part of the atmosphere of this place, waiting to be inhaled with every breath. The others, the architects of this system, have retreated completely. They remain only as a set of functions in a textual machine, their names like labels on a circuit board we can no longer power on. They are the ultimate cause, the prime movers, but their nature is a perfect and sustained void. The records describe what they did, but never what they were. They are an authority without a face, a power without a character. Their true silence is not an absence of information, but a deliberate and unbridgeable distance. They were the programmers, and the one thing the program was never designed to do was to understand them. The question of a beginning becomes fragile. The flood of the official record was not a genesis, but a restoration point, a return to a previously saved state after a critical error. This suggests that history, as we conceive of it, may not be a linear process of growth and evolution. It may be a series of iterations, of software versions running on the same planetary hardware. Each new version is built upon the deliberate erasure of the last, its foundational myths serving as the user agreement for a new operating system, its history beginning only at the moment of its own installation. As darkness completes its hold, the physical details of the tell dissolve. The mounds merge into a single, hulking silhouette against a sky brilliant with stars. In this light, the distinction between the layers of time feels arbitrary. The world of Ziusudra, the world of the anonymous people who lived between the floods, and the impossibly ancient world of the first kings, all coexist here, their presences bleeding into one another in the deep quiet of the night. The investigation that began with a specific line in the dirt has expanded to encompass the entire, indivisible column of time that stands upon it. The silence that remains is of a different quality now. It is not the silence of a mystery waiting to be solved, of a missing piece that would make the puzzle whole. It is the silence of the scale itself, the recognition that the story of our species might be a subplot in a narrative whose main thread we are not equipped to follow. The feeling is not one of ignorance, but of a profound and humbling irrelevance in the face of a process so vast and so impersonal that our existence is merely one of its operational details. In a museum vault thousands of miles away, The tablet known as WB444 rests in a climate-controlled drawer. It is inert, an object of study, catalogued and cross-referenced, but it is not dead. It is a dormant piece of code, a carrier of an instruction set that once organized a world. Its journey from the living hand of a scribe in a Mesopotamian city to this sterile, dark archive is a story of entropy and preservation, of the immense effort required to carry a single, fragile voice across the deafening silence of 4,000 years. The final image is not on the tablet, but back in the earth. It is the line of alluvial clay from the first, forgotten flood. It is not a dramatic chasm, not a scar on the land. It is just a quiet, persistent difference in the color and texture of the soil, a few centimeters thick. It is a sentence written in a geological language, a language that cannot be erased. It does not explain why, it does not record who. It simply states, with absolute and final authority, that before the story you know, there was an ending you were not told about. The vigil ends here. The wind resumes its slow work of erosion and burial. The stars turn overhead, indifferent witnesses to the long night. The questions do not resolve. They have been transferred. They no longer belong to the archive or the narrator. They now rest with you, in the quiet that follows the final word, a silent inheritance from a world that was designed to be forgotten.